everyone, and welcome to the National Army Museum. For this week's Friday Insight, here at the museum, we tell the story of the British Army and the people who served in it, from the Civil Wars to the present day, through our galleries, collections, programmes and research. There are many ways you can support this museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member, where you can get exclusive discounts and your own programme of events. So today I'm delighted to welcome Mike Nicholas. Mike works as an educator at the Tank Museum in Bovington, where he gives talks and tours. He has delivered lectures at several esteemed organisations and historical societies, including the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institute. Today he will be talking about the Battle of Ulundi, the last major battle in the Zulu War, the events leading up to the battle, as well as its tragic aftermath. So just for our online audience and in person, there will be time for questions at the end of the discussion. For the online audience, you can put them in the Q&A chat. In person, you just need to raise your hand. Moving on with some technical points, should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. A member of the team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or questions. With that all said, I will now pass over to Mike and hope you enjoy the talk.
Thank you. Right, well, a quick good afternoon and welcome to my talk. It's great to see so many of you here. So without further ado, I'll just get cracking. It was now 2:40 p.m. and the air was oven hot. The British patrol had already covered 15 miles, but their search had been in vain. Nothing moved and nothing stirred. Through the shimmering haze, every hill, every bush and tree was distorted and blurred beyond recognition. If the enemy was out there, they stood little chance of seeing them. Arriving at a small homestead, the patrol dismounted their horses and sought shade from the blazing sun. As some of the patrol rested, Corporal J. Grubb observed that fresh peelings of Inthe, a local sugarcane, was lying on the ground close to one of the huts. Although no one seemed alarmed by this discovery, nor did they seem alarmed by the tactical disadvantages that the homestead presented. Hemmed in by long grass on three sides, the entrance was more open. Less than 100 yards away was a watercourse, or donga, which had become partially filled following recent downpours. This donga was hidden and could not be seen by the homestead's new inhabitants. Despite these issues, the patrol was relaxed and no lookouts were posted. It was now 3:20 p.m. Lieutenant J. Kerry, an experienced officer, took the opportunity to survey the site. He saw nothing. But the truth is, they were the ones being observed. For more than an hour, their enemy had watched their every move, and this hidden threat was preparing to make its move. A single shot grazed past a patrol, taking them completely by surprise. This was soon followed by a volley of rifle fire. At that moment, 40 Zulu warriors emerged from the tall grass at the southern side of the homestead. As the patrol got to their feet, Lieutenant Kerry recalled, "My eyes fell upon a number of black faces rushing through the grass behind the troopers. I saw the puffs of smoke, heard the volley fired into us, and saw the Zulus rush forward with a shout. They were about 20 yards off. There was then a general rush. The sudden noise sent the horses into a panic. Some of the patrol had managed to mount their horses before the stampede. Others were not so lucky. Amongst this unfortunate group was the leader of the patrol, Louis Napoleon. He was the only son of Napoleon III, the deposed Emperor of France. Unable to mount his horse, Tommy, Louis was forced to run alongside the fleeing animal in the hope that he could vault into the saddle. The horse refused to stop, forcing Louis to hold on to the stirrup leather and a pistol holster. The Zulus were now incredibly close and advancing quickly. About 20 warriors had broken off from the main group and were advancing on the western and eastern side of the homestead, attempting to cut off the fleeing patrol, with Louis still clinging precariously to the near side of Tommy. The horse had cleared approximately 50 to 60 yards of open ground before encountering rough ground near the donga. Through a combination of uneven ground, the destabilizing and lurching weight of a man, and the speed of the horse itself, the stitching on the saddle began to snap loose. Under unbearable strain, the stitching finally gave way, and Louis tumbled to the ground. As he did so, the horse kicked him in the stomach, badly winding him. His right arm was also trampled when the horse went over him. A group of 7 to 8 Zulu were now 20 yards away, and as Louis struggled for breath, he levelled his revolver at the nearest Zulu. His first shot missed, and was rewarded by a spear striking him in the chest or left shoulder. Another spear struck the Prince Imperial, forcing him to withdraw into the donga. A Zulu warrior then appeared above him to the right. Another spear sailed down, embedding itself in Louis's thigh. Either through pulling it out or the spear having fallen from the wound, it was now in Louis's left hand. He was able to fend off further attacks for a few seconds more. Succumbing to blood loss, Louis fell backwards. It was then that the Zulu rushed him. The Prince Imperial was stabbed 18 times and eviscerated. His death... Hello? His death joined a long list of disasters that befell British forces during the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. Names such as Isandlwana, Ishawi, Intombe were seared into the souls of the men who fought and survived these engagements. And now the death of the Prince Imperial. The conflict had claimed a prominent victim, with the Napoleon dynasty being brought to a violent and abrupt end. His death sent shockwaves around the world, but two countries felt them strongly. Needless to say, France was one, the other being the United Kingdom. Following the Prince Imperial's death on the 1st of June 1879, a series of dangerous accusations and trials soon emerged. Lieutenant Carey was found guilty during a military tribunal. Rumours had begun circulating in France that the British had intentionally disposed of the prince, and civil unrest was mounting. This reached a peak when Queen Victoria was personally blamed for orchestrating the whole thing. The point is, from a British perspective, the war needed a conclusion. The British Empire's military reputation had been tarnished abroad, the Conservative government was teetering, large numbers of British troops had been killed or wounded, and international relations had been severely strained. Something had to be done, and fast. Whilst tensions were ruffling feathers in political, military and royal circles, Sir Garnet Wolseley had already boarded the steamer SS Edinburgh Castle, bound for South Africa. It set sail on the 30th of May and would take just over 3 weeks to reach the Cape. But those 3 weeks at sea would see another dramatic event. This became known as the Battle of Ulundi. By the 14th of June, word of Wolseley's arrival, as well as his supersession of the British military commander and proconsul, had reached the Cape. The Commander-in-Chief of British forces, Lord Chelmsford, was informed on the 17th of June. Therefore, the need for a decisive victory against the Zulu and redeeming his military reputation became paramount. Military reinforcements had arrived, and by the beginning of May, Chelmsford had a formidable army. In total, we are looking at around 17,000 men. Chelmsford concluded that Wolseley would reach the Cape by around the 23rd of June. It would then take him at least 2 weeks to reach the front. He believed he could destroy the Zulu during that time. Does any of that sound familiar to you? Meanwhile, Cetshwayo Kamapanda, king of the Zulus, was becoming increasingly desperate to achieve a negotiated peace. On the 4th of June, Lord Chelmsford had dispatched 3 messengers to present the latest conditions to the Zulu king. This included the restoration of all British horses, oxen, arms, and ammunition that were taken by the Zulu during the war, as well as the surrender of 1 or more Zulu regiments. With his kingdom and the fates of his people now hanging in the balance, Cetshwayo was forced to persevere. Meanwhile, the SS Edinburgh Castle had finally docked at Cape Town during the evening of the 23rd of June. Wolseley then ventured to Government House, where he was met by Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the British proconsul. Beneath the veneer of graciousness, however, Wolseley could sense that Bartle Frere was anxious by his arrival. That night, the 2 men discussed the war. In a shameful display of diverting blame, and indeed being delusional, Frere insisted that history would show that he was correct in launching the invasion of Zululand. He went on to say that the British cabinet was, I quote, weak-kneed and cowardly. Lord Chelmsford did not escape from his tirade either. Frere threw his ally under the bus by stating that Chelmsford has lost his influence and is careworn and will be very glad to be relieved. Wolseley was no fool. He was watching Frere very closely and knew that most, if not all, of what he said was an outright lie. Nonetheless, he was cheered by Frere's suggestion that Chelmsford was flagging and waiting to be relieved. This, however, could not have been further from the truth. Wolseley had underestimated Chelmsford's determination to fight on and to clear his name of any wrongdoing. For those of you who are unsure as to what I'm referring to, Chelmsford was trying to clear his name of tactical blunders he had committed during the war, which had forced those in political and military circles to question his conduct. This was particularly true of the British camp at Isandlwana. Due to Chelmsford's neglect, the camp was overrun by at least 20,000 Zulu warriors, which had led to the deaths of 1,387 troops. It was one of the worst disasters to befall the British Army during the Victorian era. On the 25th of June, Cetshwayo sent envoys to the British, begging them to halt the advance to allow the negotiations to take place. If the march on the Zulu capital continued, Cetshwayo's army would be forced to fight. In no uncertain terms, he said, "I will have no option but to resist, as there is nothing left but to try and push aside a tree that is falling upon me." A day later, Colonel Evelyn Wood's flying column descended into the valley that you see before you to destroy Zulu homesteads. However, they came across something of great importance to the Zulu. This valley was home to the ancestors of the Zulu royal house, which housed an item of spiritual importance. The Inkatha was an object of great spiritual potency to the Zulus. It was said to bind the Zulu kingdom together. Physically, it was a circular coil of braided grass, measuring about 1 meter across and as thick as a man's leg below the knee. Bound into this coil were items that had been collected over the years, which represented the unity of the nation. In this instance, it was displaying items that had been collected since the time of Shaka, to put that into perspective, the founding father of the Zulu nation. In essence, it represented a collective intimacy of people long since deceased. The coil was encased in python skin. The British, of course, were not aware of its significance, but when these homesteads were burnt, the Inkatha included, this was to bring bad omens for the Zulu. In effect, the burning of the Inkatha represented the destruction of the future unity of the Zulu kingdom. Ironically, if this spiritual artifact had been captured by the British, from a Zulu perspective, this also meant that the Zulu kingdom was now subject of the British. Cetshwayo was unaware of its destruction for some time and continued to seek peace terms. On the 27th of June, his envoys found Chelmsford's new camp, which was now a mere 17 miles from the Zulu capital. Aside from a letter from Cetshwayo, the envoys brought 2 huge elephant tusks and 150 oxen. However, Chelmsford's reply was tragically brief. On the 30th of June, Zulu envoys made a penultimate attempt for peace. A final letter was handed to Chelmsford from Cetshwayo. The envoys presented the sword of the Prince Imperial and promised yet more cattle. However, yet again, the Zulu fell afoul of a villainous underhand. Cornelius Vine, a Dutch trader, who had been captured by the Zulu and served as Cetshwayo's advisor, was called upon to translate every letter Cetshwayo would send to Chelmsford. Unbeknownst to the Zulu envoys, however, the young Dutch boy had added his own modification to Cetshwayo's original letter. It is stated that the Zulu intended to fight. This played right into Chelmsford's hands. If he could keep stalling the Zulu for preconditions, the Zulu army would not intercept him for fear of retribution. This would allow him to advance further into their territory unmolested. In the early hours of the 1st of July, British troops began moving into their final camp just short of the Zulu capital. These troops were protected by a double wagon laager and a small stone fort. Across the right Mfolozi River, they could see the Zulu. They were keeping their distance but ensuring that the British did not cross the river. On that same day, Cetshwayo made a final attempt at peace. He sent the order for a herd of royal white oxen to be sent across the river to the British camp as a peace offering. But the young warriors of the Umsijo regiment, who were guarding the fords across the river, intercepted the cattle and turned them away. They were disgusted that their king would keep pandering to an enemy who had never kept to their word, and were the clear aggressors by invading their homeland. Later that day, Cetshwayo was also in a state of despair. Whilst addressing his regiments at Ondini, Cetshwayo felt compelled to criticise the Umsijo for their callous and unauthorised decision. Fully aware that the military might of the British Empire was about to descend upon them, he knew that the British would win the pitched battle which was coming. If they lost, he and the kingdom under him would be at the mercy of the British. Unwilling to take the blame, they responded in kind by stating that the British were the aggressors here, and they would defend the Zulu kingdom to the last. Cetshwayo knew that this would likely be a one-sided battle, but he also knew that his warriors were determined to fight. All he could do was offer some parting advice. The first was that the warriors should avoid attacking entrenched British positions, and the second was that if they were successful in defeating the British in open ground, they should halt the pursuit of any stragglers as they would be in range of the British field guns on the other side of the river. At daybreak on the 3rd of July, Zulu marksmen had positioned themselves on the bluffs to the northeast of the British camp. They began targeting water parties as well as the troops in the laager itself. Any British troops by the river retreated and fell back to the camp. They waited and gave the Zulu time to fire. This was then met by the British response. At noon, artillery batteries opened fire. As shells rained down on the bluffs and the dense foliage where the marksmen were hiding, this was sending a very clear message. Noon on the 3rd of July marked the deadline for Zulu compliance with Chelmsford's conditions for peace with firepower. He also herded the cattle he had received from Cetshwayo back across the river. This was a symbolic end to the truce. An hour had passed, and with it, so had the artillery barrage. The guns fell silent. Rushing forward, 2 cavalry units prepared to encircle any surviving Zulu snipers. The northern troop, marked by the red line, was commanded by Commandant Baker of the Natal Native Horse. The other, marked by the green line, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Reivers Buller. In Buller's case, the cavalry forded the river lower down and then shifted northwards. The pincer move caught the Zulu by surprise, with any survivors fleeing back to the capital. Buller followed the retreating Zulu, hoping to recon a possible battle site. His mounted troops soon came across a dense patch of long grass directly across their path. Buller stopped his troop, sensing that something was wrong. His intuition proved correct. Hiding within the grass were 4,000 warriors belonging to the Inlongyengwe, under the command of this man, Zebebu. We will come back to his story a little later. It was fortuitous that Buller did stop, because the Zulu had prepared a trap. Across the length and breadth of this area, the Zulu had woven braids of grass which would trip horses and men. Once the riders were forcibly dismounted, the Zulu would then rush in. However, the Zulu could not wait any longer. Volley fire suddenly erupted from the grass. 3 cavalrymen were killed instantly. Others were trapped when their horses fell from under them. Lord Beresford, who was part of Buller's unit, saw that one of his troops was pinned beneath a dead horse. Unwilling to leave the man there, Beresford dismounted his horse to help. Realizing the danger, Buller ordered his men to turn and fire a volley into the long grass. This kept the Zulu down long enough for the soldier to be retrieved and for the unit to flee. After extricating the survivors, Buller returned to Chelmsford with vital intelligence. As darkness fell, the Zulu advanced to the riverside and began singing war songs to intimidate the British and to keep them awake. At 4 a.m., the troops were silently roused, had breakfast, and were then assembled to cross the river at the lower drift where Buller had crossed the day before. This was now secured by Buller's troops, which enabled the main army to cross unhindered. In total, we are looking at a main force of around 4,166 troops, 958 local auxiliaries, 12 field guns, and 2 Gatling guns. Once across the river, the main force formed up into a huge hollow square, which looked something like this. The infantry formed, 4 ranks deep, with guns, ammunition, and carts in the centre. On all sides, the cavalry formed a protective screen. Lessons had been learnt. It was essentially a formidable and mobile defensive perimeter. Zulus were spotted along the route of advance, but generally, the British force was left unmolested. And what of the Zulu? What were the British facing on that fateful day? Exact numbers are difficult to ascertain, and these figures are often disputed. The best I can offer is this account from Cetshwayo himself. After the war, Cetshwayo was interviewed, where he stated that a similar number had fought at Isandlwana. In other words, we are looking at around 20,000 warriors. There was an extra 5,000 in a reserve force, although the reserve was never actually deployed during this battle. Cetshwayo himself was not leading the army either. He had withdrawn to his family kraal, which was located 2 miles to the east of the battlefield. As the British advanced, Zulu settlements were torched. Almost as if someone had flicked a switch, this acted as a signal for the Zulu to attack. George Tunham of the 17th Lancers gave this account of what happened next. We set fire to one of the kraals, and this seemed to be a signal for the beginning of the fight. No sooner did the Zulu see smoke than they came running out of cover like a swarm of bees and completely round us. The fire was opened by the Basutus. These men are as brave as lions. They ride small, shaggy ponies that can stand any amount of fatigue. our regiment of lancers retiring with them with the infantry. The front and rear faces of the square parted to allow the cavalry through. Once they were clear and safely inside, the walls closed again. The Battle of Ulundi had begun. It was just after 9 a.m. As the Zulu skirmishers advanced, the British line readied themselves. Then came the thunderous boom of field guns firing simultaneously. The results were absolutely devastating. Bodies and parts of bodies were flung into the air, and yet amongst this ghastly mess, the Zulus kept advancing. As the Zulu army completed its envelopment of the British square, the infantry was ready to fire. Corporal William Rowe of the 58th Regiment of Foot recalled, "The fire opened from the artillery at a long range and did fearful execution, for we could see their heads, legs and arms flying in the air. In all directions on they came till they were within range of our rifles, our two front ranks kneeling and our two rear ranks standing. And when they reached the range of our rifles, we opened a fearful fire on them. They were falling down in heaps, as though they had been tipped out of carts. The Zulus returned fire, and although it was generally inaccurate, it is unsurprising that the British soldiers were being hit, considering they were in a tightly packed square. The battlefield was covered in smoke and dust. At closer range, the constant rattle of the Gatling guns rang out, accounting for more Zulu casualties. The Zulus simply could not break through this wall of fire. Most warriors got to within 30 yards of the British line, but no less. Through the swirling smoke, the Zulu attack was pressed again, but after a short while, it momentarily stopped and began to falter. As the Zulu retreated, the British began to cheer. Although, for some of these troops, this cheer was answered with a very sharp and deadly response from the Zulu. A lance corporal from the 58th Regiment, for example, who was near Corporal Rowe, began to cheer, only for a bullet to pass straight through his open mouth. Many British veterans observed that the Zulu did not seem to fight as hard as they had in previous battles. This observation was backed up when prominent Zulu commanders were interviewed after the war. They said the army was broken during the Battle of Kambula, and they did not fight with the same zeal. Kambula, by the way, fought on the 29th of March 1879, was a decisive British victory that saw 2,000 Zulu killed. The battle saw the destruction and rout of numerous Zulu regiments which had made their name in previous battles. The Umbonam, the Kenki, the Ingobamikos, the Utulwan, all were being cut down as they retreated. In total, around 1,500 Zulu were killed at this stage of the battle, but it was far from over. British casualties were 3 officers and 10 men killed, with a further officer and 69 men wounded. With the Zulu army routed, Chelmsford advanced the whole force to the banks of a stream just short of the Zulu capital. From there, Buller's cavalry were ordered to push out to Ondini and burn it to the ground. In moments of elation, this prompted mounted officers to vie for the honour of reaching the Zulu capital first. This race was won by Lord William Beresford. Unfortunately, as with any race, there is also a loser, or in this case, a dead loser. This came in the form of the Honourable William Drummond, who was ambushed and killed by a group of fleeing Zulu. Nonetheless, the advance was a massacre. Any Zulu that were found were cut down in vast swathes. Unarmed, they made for easy pickings for the cavalry. It has been estimated that another 500 Zulu were killed during this time. Buller's men ransacked the homesteads, killing anyone who crossed their path. The destruction of the Zulu kingdom was finalized when Buller's men took torches to every building in sight. Corporal Rowe again from the 58th Regiment, recalled, in a very short time, the whole of the King's city, Ulundi, was in flames. This was a fearful sight to see. You would think the whole world was on fire when there was dense mass of flames 7 miles in length. There was 7,095 kraals burned to the ground. The King's kraal was in the centre of a large circle. This circle was 5 miles rounded, and all the kraals were made of sticks and plaited straw, or at least grass, which are in the shape of a beehive. But the King's big kraal was built in the shape of a proper house with a thatched roof. Chelmsford was over the moon with this victory. He had defeated the Zulu and, he hoped, have restored his military reputation before the politicians could drag him through the mud back home. As far as he was concerned, the Battle of Isandlwana and all of its surrounding controversies had disappeared amongst the fire and smoke engulfing Undini. He congratulated and paraded his men. The band of the 1st Battalion, 13th Regiment, played Rule Britannia and God Save the Queen, before the entire force retraced its steps back to the camp. With his victory telegram completed and stored, Chelmsford withdrew his forces. Meanwhile, Cetshwayo was informed of the defeat at Ulundi, that same evening by lookouts who had been watching from nearby hills. He now had to avoid being captured by the British. During his escape, members of the Umsijo Regiment, the same men who he had criticised the day before, were now at his side again, wishing to protect him. However, Cetshwayo was forced to send them away. Large groups are easy to spot, smaller groups not so much. Escorted by a few women and his servants, he went into hiding. Incredibly, he still tried to negotiate with the British, but this would be in vain. Yet again, Chelmsford ignored instructions from Wolseley to send dispatches to him first. The reason being, Chelmsford wanted to get his story out first before anyone could dispute it. When Wolseley finally reached the British camp near the front, he was greeted with a message from Chelmsford, stating that he was resigning his command on the grounds that, I quote, "I have done a considerable amount of work over the past 18 months. I hope that this request will be favourably received." Even though Wolseley was forced to congratulate Chelmsford, deep down he was absolutely furious. The British commander was returning home as a hero, whilst Wolseley was left to clear up the mess left in his wake. Although it does need to be stressed that Wolseley would be directly responsible for making matters worse. On the 8th of July, Wolseley met with John Dunn, a diplomat originating from Durban. He was aware that Dunn was a manipulative character who was always looking to exploit opportunities for trade with some underhanded tactics, it does need to be said. Nonetheless, he was forced to work with him. He was a recognised power in South Africa, and Wolseley intended to use him for maintaining control of areas, including the now disbanded Zululand. Wolseley considered it necessary for the safety of Natal to divide Zululand into several self-governing districts, with Dunn's being the most powerful and the most important. He was instructed by the Colonial Office to divide Zululand into 13 districts and appoint a chief to each, who were overseen by a British administrator. This thought process, however, was to bring about catastrophe. On the 19th of July, Wolseley addressed a delegation of around 250 Zulu chiefs, where he laid out his plans for the division of Zululand. In his personal diary, Wolseley would write a chilling entry. "Perhaps I am brutal, but I think it is important to punish these northern tribes severely as a warning to all others in South Africa as to what they may expect should they ever be fools enough to consider waging war on the English. Up to the present, beyond shooting and wounding 10,000 men, we have not punished, I find that part particularly funny, the people as a nation, and our leniency is now allowing all the people to return to their kraals, retaining all of their cattle, and may possibly be mistaken by fear. I should like to let loose the Swazis upon these northern tribes at once, but I have to think of the howling societies at home who have sympathy with all black men. His next task was locating the Zulu king. To discourage the Zulus from hiding him, Wolseley immediately went back on his word, ordering his troops to burn kraals and loot any livestock. They were also given the authority to engage in torture to gain information. Under mounting pressure, Minyama, one of the king's closest friends, would betray him to the British. Cetshwayo had been discovered in the Ngomi forest, which lies approximately 57 miles from Ondini. On the 28th of August, Cetshwayo was tracked down and captured. Major Richard Martyr of the 1st Dragoon Guards led one of 2 patrols into the forest. He caught Cetshwayo completely by surprise. Martyr would treat the king with comparative dignity, providing ample food and shelter, as well as posting guards to ensure that no harm was done to him, namely by British troops. On the 31st of August, Cetshwayo was brought back to Wolseley's camp overlooking the still smouldering remains of Ondini. In an incredible display of grace and dignity, Cetshwayo walked in there looking like a true warrior. He did not bow his head, nor did he, in the face of his enemy, he stood tall and proud. Wolseley's arrogance shone through. Not to be outdone, he declined to meet Cetshwayo. Instead, he made sure that the Zulu king received a letter saying that he was now a prisoner of the British, and he would remain so. At that moment, Cetshwayo was seen to visibly crumble. The 1st of September 1879 was a brutally hot day. But think of this as a metaphor for the events to follow. 200 senior Zulu dignitaries and chiefs were summoned to the British headquarters at Ulundi. Interpreting for them was John Shepston, whose brother had been killed at Isandlwana. The Zulu were informed that Cetshwayo had been captured and exiled. They were then told that Zululand would be divided into 13 independent chiefdoms, with each chief being selected and appointed by the British. If this sounds like a bad idea to you, you would be absolutely correct. This was never going to end well. The appointed chiefs were deliberately selected from those who had fought on the side of the British or had deserted Cetshwayo prior to his arrest. This was intended to create political disharmony, rivalries, and increase existing tensions. In essence, the British were wanting Zululand to destroy itself from within. They also knew that senior Zulu generals who had fought for Cetshwayo during the war would be immediately targeted, thus destroying future threats of an uprising. Little did they realize. This division inevitably led to further bloodshed. The Pedi tribe, whose domain bordered northern Zululand, was a large and powerful independent African kingdom. It had been fiercely opposed to European settlement, but it was also pragmatic enough to take advantage of the economic benefits it offered. This came following the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in the late 1860s, making them a powerful economic threat to the British. In response, the British called upon the Swazis, who had a long-standing grievance with the Pedi. Backed by British troops, the Swazi met the Pedi in battle in November 1879, with the Swazi emerging victorious. Another major thorn had been removed from the British side. However, following Wolseley's harsh treatment of the Zulu by creating division, many Zulu began objecting to chiefs being imposed upon them from different tribes. Attempting to stem the flow, albeit far too late, Wolseley told the Boundaries Commission that the Zulu were free to move to another chief's territory. Talk about missing the obvious points. What Wolseley had failed to understand is that the Zulu were physically and spiritually bonded to the places where they were born, to areas where their ancestors had farmed and had raised families of their own. For these reasons, they were never going to adhere to European attempts at political or economic manipulation. The Boundary Commissioners realised very quickly that serious trouble was brewing. They reported back to Wolseley that the chiefs, particularly James Dunn, were unsuitable for their roles and that partition should be reconsidered. Wolseley discarded that element of the report, although he must have realised that the British had now lost control. Once again, the chief who was proving problematic for the British was our old friend Zebebu. He had already proven to be a devious and manipulative character. Despite having forged a distinguished career during the Anglo-Zulu War, his lust for power was becoming too much. During the partition of Zululand, he was placed in charge of a district. Zebebu's appointment, as well as the eventual British victory over the Zulu, had exposed a hidden and dangerous sting in the tail. Unbeknownst to the British, the Zulu victories early in the war had shown the chinks in their armour. Other parties, such as the Boer, had begun to sit up and take notice. With open rebellion against British rule looming, Zebebu had opened negotiations with the Boer. In other words, the enemy of my enemy is now my friend. Realising they had lost control, the colonial authorities in South Africa and London began to panic. Reports were flooding back saying that there was widespread civil unrest in Zululand, and it was likely to escalate if left unresolved. This reached the highest levels of British society. It was in this moment that they turned to the very man that they had sought to overthrow to begin with. Although Queen Victoria was wary of interfering with her government, she urged for her ministers to consider repatriating Cetshwayo to restore order. His return to Zululand was delayed, but only because the colonial administrators needed more time to reduce the area that Cetshwayo could control. The British were justifiably worried about the Boer, but they were also quietly counting on his return, bringing further unrest. Cetshwayo was reinstated as King of the Zulus in February 1883. It was then decided that Zululand would be divided into 3 sectors. The northern part was controlled by Zebebu, the centre by Cetshwayo, and the southern end was reserved for Zulus who did not want to be ruled by either. Cetshwayo and his followers were now effectively sandwiched between his enemies in the north as well as the British Natal in the south. Again, this was never going to end well. Cetshwayo sought help from the British, who unsurprisingly declined. With Zebebu attacking any Zulu who he thought was loyal to Cetshwayo, it was inevitable that this was going to be met with a military incursion. Zebebu, Cetshwayo's one-time cousin, was now his mortal enemy. On the 21st of July, battle was joined. Warriors loyal to the king, consisting of an army of around 5,000, engaged Zebebu's army, who were backed by Boer commandos. Zebebu's army retreated, but this was a tactical maneuver, basically it was nothing more than a feint. His army got behind Cetshwayo's and annihilated them. Amongst the dead were Nshinwayo, the general who had led Zulu forces at Isandlwana and Kambula. Cetshwayo fled to Ashawi, where on the 17th of October he sought the protection of the British resident commissioner. King Cetshwayo would die following a meal on the 8th of February 1884. This is highly suspicious, considering that on that same day he was seen walking and appeared in good health. Most likely, he was poisoned by his own people. Zulus were familiar with various poisons that could be incorporated into various snuffs and beers, both of which the king liked. Suspicions of foul play were increased when the Zulu did not raise the alarm for 4 hours. And when the British doctor did arrive to examine the body, he was denied the opportunity to perform a post-mortem. The Zulu king, who had seen and endured so much hardship during his reign, was buried in a beautiful part of the Nkandla forest close to the Momi Gorge. Cetshwayo's heir, Prince Dinizulu, would go on to inherit a country in ruins, one ravaged by civil war, and an economy that was devastated by the war with the British. Even though the British were disinterested in the human tragedy that was unfolding before them, they certainly did not escape from this unscathed. Rather fittingly, Wolseley was lambasted. The British public and politicians openly attacked his conduct in South Africa. It was a very public humiliation for a man who, up to that point, was seen as the darling of the British military. And yet, he would go on to gain many awards, including a seat in the Council of India in November 1876 and High Commissioner of Cyprus on the 12th of July 1878. With Zebebu's victory having been achieved with the assistance of the Boer commandos, the British looked on with great concern. Boer influence in South Africa was increasing. Although their motivations were driven by self-interest and expansion, they were, for now, providing military assistance and finances to certain chiefdoms in Zululand. With Cetshwayo dead, Zebebu and Chief Hamu, two prominent leaders in the northern sector of Zululand, began a systematic dismantling of the old order. However, something dramatic then occurred. In a last-ditch attempt to retain the Zulu royal house, some of Cetshwayo's followers severed relations with the British and sought help from the Boers. The Boers granted Prince Dinizulu a safe sanctuary in the Transvaal, and on the 21st of May 1883, pronounced him King of the Zulus. The result was incredible. Those that sought refuge from Zebebu now came out of hiding and offered allegiance to their new king. Backed by Boer guns, Zebebu's army received no mercy. Their violent and devious leader was forced to flee, passing away in 1904. Sadly, this newfound freedom came at a heavy price, as the Boer now demanded a vast swathe of Zululand in payment, including the disputed territories which had been so bitterly fought over in the 1870s. The Zulu were now sandwiched between two aggressive white powers. The torments and hardships, of which there are too many to mention here, would continue until 1975. But let's end this talk on a positive note. In 1975, inspired by previous rulers who had focused on Zulu unity in the face of outside intimidation, Prime Minister Buthelezi founded the Inkatha Freedom Party. After 76 years of vicious turmoil and tensions, Zululand was once again ruled by its own leaders. It was an unprecedented move that gained international support. After enduring years of European attempts to convert the Zulu people to Christianity, to force them to adopt modernization, or to basically impose socialization, the Zulu prevailed. It really is, I feel, an incredible demonstration of their resilience and their determination. To this day, rural Zulus have gone on to live in their timeless way. And finally, I would like to thank all of you, whether in person or online, for attending my talk today. It is great to see that even after 146 years, the Anglo-Zulu War and its aftermath still generates enough interest for you to have attended this lecture. And that in itself is something. So thank you so much.